New laws were brought in last year under the Foreign Relations Act that require public universities and other institutions to disclose when they enter into arrangements, deals with foreign government entities. These laws were introduced to protect Australia's national interest. It gave the Foreign Minister the power to veto any deals. They were used to cancel the Victorian Belt and Road Agreement in May this year, as you know.
Australia's policies and plans and the rules that we make for our own country are made here in Australia according to our needs and our interests, and we'll continue to do that.
But now there are questions over whether the University of Sydney has properly abided by this new law. The university claims it's played by the rules, but as I'll show you now, there's evidence that there are questions that the deal they may be entering into needs to be examined. The university deliberately decided not to declare to the Australian government that it's on the cusp of awarding a multi-million-dollar contract to a Chinese government-funded company. This would seem to be an apparent breach of the foreign disclosure laws. The University of Sydney has been running a confidential tender process for health equipment worth $14 million. There are two final candidates, Siemens and United Imaging Healthcare. Now, company records show that United Imaging Healthcare Australia and New Zealand is entirely owned by the British company United Imaging Healthcare UK, which is then 100% owned by Shanghai United Imaging Healthcare. It's a point the University of Sydney itself discovered in its due diligence report, where it said that the Shanghai company, and I quote, has a very complex set of shareholders with probable links to the Chinese government. I've obtained leaked commercial in conference documents, and they're dated just November 25 this year, very recent. And these documents include the admission from the University of Sydney that it has no plans to make any disclosure to DFAT at all. This is what the University of Sydney says in its due diligence report. The presence of such CCP board members means that the company would not be considered autonomous for purposes of under the Foreign Relations Act. So if we had a direct agreement or arrangement with them, we would need to disclose it to DFAT under the Act, they said. They then went on to say, and I quote, however, the uni would be directly purchasing from a subsidiary twice removed. We don't need to report the transaction with a subsidiary located in Australia. So just to make that very clear, the University of Sydney, in its own due diligence report, is claiming that the Australian company they're considering awarding this $14 million bid to is twice removed from the Shanghai company, even though it is entirely owned by it, and even though they've said that the company has probable links to the Chinese government and Communist Party. But the links don't stop there. One of the listed Australian directors is also co-president of the Shanghai company, and another Australian director is a director at the UK subsidiary. The Shanghai company has also twice loaned money to the Australian business, $148,000 in both 2018 and 2019, according to financial reports that have been lodged with the corporate regulator. And the UK company, which is the sole shareholder of the American, Poland and Japan subsidiaries, also loaned the Australian outfit more than $500,000 in 2019. Now, Shanghai United Imaging Healthcare has received hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from entities backed or owned by the Chinese Communist Party. And this is detailed in a capital raising round from September 2017. This company, United Imaging, would be supplying the University of Sydney and the Royal North Shore Hospital with Sydney's premier whole-body scanner. It detects tumours and can track their spread. As I said, it's more than $14 million contract. Intelligence sources have told me the concern of Chinese infiltration here is amplified by the fact that United Imaging also has an artificial intelligence arm. It's called United Imaging Intelligence, and it uses AI software to analyse patient data that's been amassed by the company. The concern here, and we'll hear it from a cybersecurity expert in a moment who's looked at this, the concern here is twofold. Firstly, it's China's ability to access data from this scanner, but also, and more crucially, it's the ability to breach the firewall through the scanner to access New South Wales Health data and the network. The intelligence source told me the whole point of AI is to use big data. They will be able to have, without even having to go inside the firewall, they will be able to amass big data at source in the scanner and then send it back to China. The source said, in a way, every one of these machines is a source of biomedical espionage in that it allows them to compile biomedical big data that they can use for their own technological development. As I mentioned earlier, the University of Sydney has completely rejected the idea that they needed to disclose this in any way, shape or form to anyone in the federal government. They've said an independent probity advisor, together with senior representation from the university and the district, continue to oversee the procurement process to ensure a fair and competitive process. They say they've complied with all obligations under Australian law and other government sanctions and defence export controls, including their DFAT obligations. Joining me now to go through this and discuss this in some more detail is cybersecurity expert and co-founder at Internet 2.0, Robert Potter. Robert, thank you very much for your time, and great to have you here in person now that lockdown's over and borders have been lifted.
It's great to be back.
Now, I want to start with how one scanner could enable Chinese state-owned enterprises or companies to access New South Wales Health data.
Well, anything that we allow inside our networks has to be controlled from a supply chain point of view in terms of the risks that it introduces into our network. When we assess technology like this, when it's deployed on networks, it still has to be receiving updates and information back from its mothership. And in this case, that would be back in mainland China. So by allowing a technology like this inside our network, we're increasing our risk. And it's a real question as to whether or not we're unnecessarily doing that if we have other alternatives.
So the risk is that they could, through this scanner, breach the firewall and access other data that might be contained by New South Wales Health on their networks.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a great example out of the United States of a company called PAX Networks, which was recently raided by the FBI. They sold point-of-sale machines, so like FPOS terminals, into companies, and they were used as a beachhead to attack networks by offshore threat actors in China. So in this case, it's the same risk of deploying something inside your network. Medical technology is really difficult to quarantine within a network because it requires all of its updates from the inventor of the intellectual property, which in this case is a Chinese invention, and it would rely on that for its update cycle. So it's very similar to the risk that we saw in Huawei. And connecting this into our critical infrastructure really introduces risks that we may not need to introduce if we have other options in these tenders.
Yes, of course. Just in terms of how great the threat is in the biomedical space, from your experience working in this area, have we seen any escalation of risk or have we seen cyber hacks or attacks on the hospital network here in Australia?
Well, the majority of disclosed attacks on critical infrastructure in Australia occur on medical companies and in the health sector. So it's already considered the underperformer in the critical infrastructure space compared to others like finance and energy.
Why is that? Why are Chinese entities so keen to get health data or biomedical data?
Well, it's very useful for a lot of different reasons, and it's because it's quite cost effective to get if you can collect it through other people's networks. There's entire companies in China that receive defence contracts from the Chinese government to undertake intellectual property theft, for example, and to collect big data to feed these sorts of systems.
Do you think there is still some level of naivety at the university level? I mean, you've read the response from the University of Sydney that was contained in their due diligence report, where they say they didn't feel like they needed to disclose this because it was 2 steps removed from the Chinese company, when in fact it was entirely owned, and the links it's virtually one and the same company.
Yeah, I think there's a huge naivety combined with an unwillingness to really face up to vendor risk. Supply chain risk isn't something that's really simple to fix, because everything that we plug into our networks brings risks into it. And so when we have a choice between a company that's that's producing a technology made in China or one that's made in Germany, I think the decision around cyber risk should really be a deciding factor, even if the other vendor is slightly more expensive.
Yeah. Don't know if you would be able to answer this question, but do you think the federal government has some awareness that there might be, and not just universities, but other institutions that might feel that they don't need to disclose potential deals under the Foreign Relations Disclosure Act?
Well, compliance with the Act is one thing. It's still very new, and universities are still trying to figure out what they should disclose or what they shouldn't. But when there's doubt, I think you should generally err on just working with people who have the experience to help you make better decisions in this space.
Yes.
So it's one thing for the university to say, look, we've received advice from the Australian government and this is fine, but not to pursue that advice when you don't really have that expertise in-house, which the universities really don't yet. They don't have big enough muscles to lift this sort of risk. And so going externally and taking the free advice from the Australian government, which is an expert in this space, just makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert Potter, thank you very much for your time and for your insights throughout the year.
Thanks.